Welcome back to Monitoring Clinical Trials. My name is Steve Pope. This week we're going to be talking about safety and patient protection. A very important concept, probably one of the chief things that you're going to be involved in when monitoring a site on a clinical trial. So let's get into our purpose. All serious adverse events should be reported immediately to the sponsor, except for those SAEs that the protocol or other documentation, for example, the investigator's brochure, identifies as not needing immediate reporting. The immediate reports should be followed promptly by detailed written reports. The immediate and follow-up reports should identify the subjects by unique code numbers assigned to the trial subjects rather than the subjects' names, personal identification numbers, and or addresses. The investigator should comply with the applicable regulatory requirements related to reporting of unexpected serious adverse drug reactions to the regulatory authorities and the IRB/IAC. So a couple things going on here. We're going to clearly identify what a serious adverse event is in just a moment, but we have some very specific reporting requirements, and they come from ICAG 6 Section 4.11 Safety Reporting. Our learning objectives will be to discuss adverse events and serious adverse events, the difference between the two and how we categorize one versus the other. Cite the requirements for safety reporting. This would be both for the site and also for the sponsor when related to serious adverse events. Discuss the role of the monitor in subject safety, and then finally discuss notification of investigators to trial safety information. So what's required there and how we go about doing that. So let's get started by discussing adverse events, or AEs, and serious adverse events, or SAEs. So first, let's answer the question, what is an adverse event? An adverse event is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or a clinical trial subject administered a medicinal product which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. So basically, it's any change in a subject's health from baseline. So when the subject comes in for their screening visits, as we've learned, we're going to take medical history. We're also going to have medical records that we examine, that we review. So we're going to have a pretty good knowledge of what that subject's baseline health assessment is. So any change in that is going to be considered an adverse event. It could be a very minor change. It could be a headache. It could be diarrhea. It could be nausea. It could be they fell down and bruised their knee. Or it could be something very serious. It could be a stroke. It could be a heart attack. It could be a cardiac event. We never know. But essentially, anything that creates a change in that patient's medical baseline is considered an adverse event. We'll get into the differences between adverse events and serious adverse events in just a moment. When we're monitoring a site in a clinical trial, it's important for us to understand, where do adverse events come from? How do we discover them? How does the site know that they exist? Well, they come from a number of different areas. They could be reported by the subject, which is where many of them come from. So the subject comes in for their visit, and the coordinator or whoever they talk with first asks them, have there been any changes to your in your medical condition since you were here last? Because it may have been a few weeks or a month or so since they were in for their last visit. And they say, well, experienced a headache and some diarrhea, or I broke my arm, or I had some other medical issue. I had to go to the emergency room. All of these responses from the subject would indicate that there's very likely an adverse event that needs to be reported. There could be an adverse event that's discovered by an investigator from questioning the subject. Also could be discovered when performing a physical exam. Once again, you could discover an adverse event in that fashion. Adverse events can oftentimes appear on lab reports, so out-of-range lab findings may indicate an adverse event. And these are things that in many cases, in fact in nearly all the cases, a subject is not going to be aware of them. They aren't going to be aware when some lab finding is out of range. Could be related to a finding on an ECG or some other type of medical report. A good example of that would be the subject had to go visit their doctor, or they had to go to the emergency department. And so we get a medical record from the emergency department, and we discover an adverse event that the patient probably wasn't even aware of, that occurred during that initial condition that sent them to the emergency room. They could be observed by site staff during a visit, such as a vital sign reading, for example. That could trigger an adverse event. So they could be discovered in a number of different ways. So it's important that we understand this, because as you're monitoring and you're reviewing the data and you're doing your source data review, it's important to question the site. If you suspect that an adverse event may have occurred, question the site about it and have the investigator determine whether or not this is indeed an adverse event. So when we're talking about adverse events, we're invariably, at some point, probably going to discover a serious adverse event. So serious adverse event is an adverse event which meets certain criteria. It results in death. It could be an adverse event that is life-threatening in the assessment of the principal investigator. It could be an adverse event that requires hospitalization or prolongs an existing hospitalization. It could be an adverse event that results in a persistent or significant disability or incapacity. And then finally, it could be an adverse event that consists of a congenital anomaly or birth defect. So this may be one that we don't discover until after the trial is over. That could occur. So serious adverse event is basically one that results in death, requires hospitalization, life-threatening. These would be the primary principal conditions that you're likely to encounter when you're reviewing adverse events at your site and determining whether or not they fit the criteria for a serious adverse event. So how do adverse events appear in subject source documents or data? Normally what will occur is the site will have an adverse event log where they record various adverse events, and depending on the patient population and what their medical condition is, you can have patients that maybe only have 1 or 2 adverse events, or you can have patients that have 25 or 30, just depending on how sick they are. The duration of the trial has a lot to do with that. Obviously, the longer the trial runs, the more likely you are to collect more adverse events. So the PI or the PI's delegate will assess each adverse event and determine whether it is mild, severe, or serious. The severity will include the intensity of the adverse event. So it's important to understand that you can have, an intense adverse event that isn't necessarily serious, And then you also want to assess, or the PI will assess, the relationship to the study drug. That is something that could potentially change, over the course of time as the adverse event gets more review and we learn more about, adverse events and how they occur with this particular study medication. You're also going to indicate, or the site is going to record the action taken with the study drug, and also with treatment or not non-treatment for the adverse event. So an adverse event might occur and you stop the study drug for a few days or a period of time, and then you also provide some treatment for the adverse event. And so we're going to record all of that on our adverse event log, and that's going to trigger, in many cases, some additions to our concomitant medication log, and it also may trigger an entry on our IP accountability log. So all of these log pages can be affected by what we enter on one versus the other. So let's look at the requirements for safety reporting, and this would be safety reporting by the investigator or the investigative site. So first of all, they must be reported to the sponsor within 24 hours of learning of the serious adverse event. Now, it's important to understand that this time frame is from the time that the site first learns of the SAE, not necessarily when the SAE started. In fact, in nearly every case, it won't be when the SAE started, because in all fairness, it's probably occurred in the past by maybe several weeks. So the moment at which they learn of a serious adverse event, or if they suspect that it's a serious adverse event, then they need to report that to the sponsor within 24 hours. So how do they report that? The reporting could be done by picking up the phone and calling. It might be done by sending a fax, or many sponsors have some type of portal or website where they are notified of serious adverse events, and that is a portal that many times is going to be manned on an ongoing basis. So they're going to learn of it as soon as possible. But the key here is that the site's responsibility is to report that within 24 hours, and in many cases, what they're reporting is very basic information. Subject was admitted to the hospital with chest pains. Hey, you know what? That's all we know right now. Until we get medical records, until we have a chance to talk to the subject, we really don't have any other information. But we report that to the sponsor, so we've met that 24-hour criteria. At that point, the medical staff, the sponsor's medical staff and drug safety team kick into gear, and they start communicating with the site, and they're going to collect as much information as they can, as quickly as they can. And then finally, it needs to be reported to the IRB by the site staff. So once again, there may be very basic information that gets reported, but we need to get that to the IRB as soon as possible. So as monitors, what is our role in all of this subject safety items? So first of all, we're going to ensure that all adverse events are collected on the ECRF, that they're adequately documented in the subject source, they've been reviewed by the PI or the PI's delegate, and we've entered that information, or the site has entered that information into the electronic case report file. We're going to ensure that all SAEs are reported to the sponsor within 24 hours. If we discover that it has not been reported within 24 hours, then we want to issue a deviation on that and ensure that it gets reported as soon as possible. We're going to ensure that SAEs are reported to the IRB. Now, in order to do this, we've got to be aware of what the IRB's reporting requirements are. In some cases, Some IRBs only want to have SAEs that have a causal relationship with the study drug reported. So we need to make sure that PIs or the delegate are adequately reviewing those SAEs for causality. And then finally, we want to ensure that all safety information is filed at the site. That includes any records of telephone conversations with the subject, any medical records that we've received, communication with the IRB where we communicated and submitted that SAE, and hopefully we got an acknowledgement back from the IRB that they received that. And then any communication that we've had with the sponsor, because we're going to have a lot of communication going back and forth with the safety team at the sponsor. So we want to document all of that at our site and make sure that we can keep all of that in one location so that it's easy not only for the monitor to review when they come, but any auditors that may come can review that, and also so that the site staff can put their hands on it in case they've got follow-up from the sponsor's safety team. So we've talked about what the investigator's responsibility is as far as reporting SAEs. Let's talk about the notification of investigators to trial safety information. So these will come out from time to time, and the sponsor will notify each investigator of safety information that meets certain requirements. Now, normally these will be serious adverse events that they have determined, the sponsor has determined, have a causal relationship with the study medication. These are usually communicated using what's known as a SUSAR, which is a suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reaction. So these will be formal documents that get sent to sites, ordinarily in paper form, but they may be submitted electronically as well. These are sometimes referred to as IND safety letters. Now, IND safety letters, or SUSARs, they also need to be reported to the IRB, because the IRB needs to be aware, the IRB panel that is, needs to be aware of the safety profile of that particular investigational product. So any change to that safety profile, they need to be able to study and to assess, to determine, if this trial meets their safety requirements to be continued. Now, usually these IND safety letters will be submitted on a CIOMS form, which stands for Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. So that's just the format of the form that this information can be submitted on. So you'll probably see some of these when you go out to your sites. So it'd be good to be familiar with what they look like. So I just spoke briefly about adverse reactions. So we have serious adverse events versus adverse drug reactions. So let's start by going back, and we'll take a look at the definition for an adverse event, which is any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject administered a pharmaceutical product, and which does not necessarily have to have a causal relationship with this treatment. That differs from an adverse drug reaction in that the pre-approval clinical experience with a new medicinal product or its new usages, particularly as the therapeutic dose or doses may not be established. So all noxious and unintended responses to a medicinal product related to any dose should be considered adverse drug reactions. So the phrase responses to medicinal products means that a causal relationship between a medicinal product and an adverse event is at least a reasonable possibility, i.e., the relationship cannot be ruled out. So fundamentally, this is an adverse drug reaction is related to whether or not there is a causal relationship between the investigational product and the adverse event. So if we can't rule out that there is no causal relationship, then very likely we're going to decide upon that this is an adverse drug reaction. So let's look at the sponsor notification of safety information to the FDA. So these reporting requirements are detailed in ICH E2A. So we have fatal or life-threatening unexpected ADRs or adverse drug reactions. These need to be reported within 7 calendar days. Now this is the sponsor reporting this to the FDA. These will be followed by as complete a report as possible within an additional 8 calendar days. So that would bring us out to day 15. So you've got the initial reporting within 7 days, and then followed by a complete report as possible for an additional 8 or within 15 calendar days. So in addition to that, all other serious, unexpected adverse drug reactions should be reported no later than 15 calendar days with as complete a report as possible. So this details some of the reporting requirements that are required of the sponsor. So as a monitor, you may or may not be too involved in this process, but you need to be aware of it because there may be information that where you need to be involved in collecting information from the site perhaps, or you might be asked to verify certain information that the site has submitted to the sponsor related to this unexpected adverse drug reaction. So it's important to understand what those time frames are. You have a number of reading assignments for this week. First of all, from the CRA's Guide to Monitoring Clinical Research. Chapter 15, Adverse Events and Safety Monitoring. Also, we've got a couple of the portion of the regs to take a look at. So, Clinical Safety Data Management, definitions and standards for expedited reporting. You're going to find that on Moodle. Also, 21 CFR 312.32, which is IND safety reporting. This is from the FDA website. I'll put the link here. There's also a link on the module page in Moodle, so you can very quickly pull that up and read through it. Then we've got another requirement for safety reporting requirements for INDs in BA and BE studies. And then finally, we've got IND application reporting safety reports. So a number of reading assignments to go through this week to become more familiar with what's involved in assessing adverse events, reporting them, and what your responsibility is from the monitoring perspective, what the site ought to be doing, and then certainly what the sponsor is going to do with the regulatory authority as they move forward. So for your online assignment for the week, we have a discussion forum question. So you are on site monitoring and performing source data review, and you discover what you think is a serious adverse event among a subject's medical data. So what action would you take and why? So I want you to think about that question as you're going through this week's content, and then post your assessment in the week's discussion forum by Thursday evening, and then comment on at least 2 others of your fellow students' postings. I'll be on there to kind of manage and be taking a look at your postings as you're going along. But do try and get that out there by Thursday evening. I'm looking forward to seeing your responses to this. And then do let me know if you have questions or if there's something that you need further clarified. So, good luck to you. I'll see you this week on the discussion forum.